Welcome to Brainish English Stories.
She was a mom and she took care of 5 kids, even though she was only 9 years old. 2 of the kids were twins, and she called them Mr. Amplach's kids, even though Mr. Amplach didn't know them. People thought the twins looked like their dad. The other kids were dolls of different ages, but the twins were her own idea. But she treated all the kids the same. She called them the Amplach's kids just to describe them, not because they were different. Her own mom had died when she was little. Her dad, Robert Fawkes, worked hard driving a wagon between Big Bend and Reno. Sometimes when she wasn't with him, she and her kids would end up scattered along the road. But kind people who knew her would always bring them back together. I remember Jim Carter walking into a bar after walking 5 miles through a snowstorm, with one of the Amplach twins in his pocket. "Mary should be more careful with those Amplach kids," he said. "I found one in the snow a mile past Big Bend." "I didn't know Mr. Amplach had kids," someone said in the bar. Jim winked at us. "Me neither," he said sadly. "But you can't know everything about those respectable folks." Later, when he was alone with Mary, or Miri, as she said it, Jim made her feel bad by telling her how the baby Amplach suffered in the snowstorm and kept asking for her until she cried. "Let this be a lesson," he said, pulling the baby out of his pocket. It took almost a quart of the best whiskey to warm that child up. Mary believed him completely, and for weeks, Julian Amplach, this unhappy twin, was kept asleep in the cart, and people thought he got bad habits from his strong drink. Her big family grew in just 2 years, starting with her first doll, which Mr. William Dodd, also a wagon driver, brought from Sacramento as a special gift for her 7th birthday. She called it a Misery, a mix of a Missy, her old nickname, and a Missouri, her home state. It was a huge doll at first because Mr. Dodd wanted to make sure he got his money's worth. But with time and maybe too much attention from Mary, it lost weight and some parts of its limbs. It got even smaller after it got run over by the wagon, especially its head and shoulders. Its skin peeled off and it looked weird. Then, one morning after a bath, its head and shoulders disappeared, leaving 2 ugly iron prongs sticking out of its body. Mary, dressed in her blue pinafore, went to see Jack Roper, the blacksmith. He suggested turning the doll upside down to use its legs, but Mary didn't like that idea. Jack promised to fix it, and the next day, he gave Mary back her doll with a new iron head painted red. It was a bit too big and heavy, and it made the other dolls uncomfortable, but Mary was happy to have her Misery back. She loved it even though it didn't have a face. She would sit with it on a stump, surrounded by her other dolls, singing to it as bees buzzed around and shadows danced on its iron face. Mary thought it looked like it was smiling because she loved it so much. The last 2 members of Mary's family were less special. Gloriana, called a Gloriana by her dad, was just a roll of canvas with a face drawn on it. It didn't look very good. Johnny Deere was a plaster head and bust with a body made by Mary. It looked like a boy and was the most human-like of all her dolls. People often mistook it for a real child. Once, a coach driver even stopped to give it back to Mary, thinking it was a lost child. Mary didn't seem to like regular dolls with their fancy faces and hair. She preferred her own creations. She dressed them up however she liked, even if it meant covering up their faces or changing their heads. She wasn't always careful with her dolls, sometimes leaving them in the woods or ditches. But she believed nature would take care of them, and it usually did. Rats, mice, and even big animals like panthers never harmed her dolls. Only when they faced a civilized world did they get into trouble. Once, a goat tried to eat one of her dolls and lost its teeth, and a mule got hurt trying to play with another. But those were simpler times along the road between Big Bend and Reno. As things got better, people started saying Mary should go to school. Mr. Amplock, who didn't know about the stories involving his name, thought Mary needed to go to school. People said her wandering ways were not good for the county. She grew up knowing only the kindness of the men around her and the generosity of nature. There was a big argument between the people who traveled the road and the families who lived in the settlement. The families won, and Mary had to go to school because a railroad was coming and her dad had a job there. But what about Mary's dolls? No school would take them all. Jack Roper, the blacksmith, came up with a solution. Mary could bring one doll to school with her, and her friends would take care of the others. Mary chose a Johnny Deere, surprising everyone. It was the first sign that she was growing up and learning to follow the rules of society. Johnny Deere was the most presentable of her dolls, and it had educational value with its marked-out head. Mary's friends took good care of the dolls. The blacksmith even kept Misery, the iron-headed doll, on a shelf like a treasure. Mary was faithful to her dolls, visiting them every Saturday. Once, she surprised the manager of the new railroad with her doll, talking about its cough and how she had just visited her other doll, Misery. The manager played along, talking to Mary as if the doll was real, showing kindness and understanding. Mary's eyes were shining with happiness as she kissed the manager, laughed a little, and then looked shyly at the two strangers. She waved goodbye and ran off, her blue pinafore fluttering behind her. She took good care of her other dolls too. Jim Carter, who lived far away, brought Gloriana, the rag baby, to Mary's house every Saturday. On Sundays, all the dolls would dress up, which made Mary happy for the rest of the week. But one Saturday and Sunday, Mary didn't show up. She had to go to San Francisco to meet an aunt who had come from far away. Without Mary, Sundays felt empty to the people on the road. The next Sundays were even worse because they heard that Mary's aunt was sending her to a fancy school in Santa Clara, where girls became very smart. But we knew Mary would always be the same. She sent us a letter before she went to the school. It wasn't addressed to anyone in particular, but it made us feel like we could hear her voice again. There are so many houses in San Francisco, and lots of women, but no mules or jackasses with shoes, and no blacksmith shops anywhere. There are rabbits, squirrels, bears, and panthers, which I remember because of the streets and Sunday schools. Jim Roper, you better take care of Misery while I'm not here, and don't be mean to her just because she's a bit heavy, which is not true. I have a canary bird that sings beautifully, but it's not a yellowhammer like you think. Dear Mr. Montgomery, don't keep Julian Amplock shut up in office drawers too much, it's not good for him. And don't paint his head either. You're just as bad as the others. Johnny Deere, be kind to your adopted father, and Gloriana, you must love Jim Carter very much for taking you on horseback rides often. I went for a ride in a buggy with an officer who has really killed Indians. I'll be coming back soon with lots of love, so be ready and take care. It was 3 years before Mary came back, and that was her last letter. But her friends who took care of her dolls stayed faithful. When the new railroad was finished, and Mary was supposed to be there with her dad for the ceremony, her friends came to the station to meet her. They stood along the platform, and Jack Roper was carrying a bundle. Then, a young girl, dressed in a pretty dress with perfect boots and gloves, got off the train. She shook hands with each of her old friends, smiling warmly at them with her blue eyes. But as she walked away with her dad, her friends realized their faces were as red as they were on the day Yuba Bill brought Johnny Deere on the coach. "You didn't bring misery, did you?" Jack Montgomery asked Roper. "I did," Roper said with a nervous laugh. "And you?" He saw a 9-pin sticking out of the manager's pocket. The man laughed, and then they all turned away quietly. Mary had come back, but she wasn't the same little girl anymore.